So now, Saul, conversion, is baptized, completely radically changing his frame of thought toward Christianity. He was commanded now to go out and do the same thing as the apostles, right? What were the apostles commanded to do at the very end before Jesus ascended to heaven? To go into the whole world and do what? To teach and to baptize, right? The apostles had that command. They received that command from Christ. Now Paul has this command to go out and do the same. But Paul was lacking something that the apostles had. To go out and preach. What did Paul lack that the apostles had?
He didn't have the personal knowledge.
What's that, Mike?
He was not commissioned by Jesus specifically.
Okay, Paul wasn't commissioned specifically by Jesus. Good.
He didn't have Jesus' teaching right there.
But he was taught. He ended up getting the teaching, but he didn't have something that the apostles had. Authority. Remember, the apostles received authority from Christ to go out and speak in His name. Paul needed that authority now. So let's see if Paul gets authority. Any bets? Acts chapter 13, verse 1. Let's see what happens just before Saul goes out to preach the gospel message. Because think of it. He's going to be speaking in the name of Christ. Can any old person just go out and speak for Christ? They do all the time, yeah. But do they have authority? No. So let's read Acts chapter 13, verse 1.
Now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manon, who was a close friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them."
Okay. So what's happening here? There's a bunch of people listed, and they are prophets and teachers, right? And then what happens in verse 2? Who speaks? The Holy Spirit. God now speaks, and what does the Holy Spirit say?
Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul.
Okay, out of these people, choose Barnabas and Saul for the work which I have called them. And in verse 3, what happened to Saul and Barnabas?
And completing their fasting and prayer, they laid hands on them and sent them off.
What did the apostles do?
They laid hands.
What right do apostles have to lay hands?
Because they received the authority from
Remember, authority. Christ had authority. He gave to the apostles. Now the apostles are giving that apostolic authority to Paul and Barnabas. So this is the conversion of Saul. This is the baptism of Saul. How he receives the Holy Spirit, becomes a member of God's family, and now how he receives the authority to go out and preach. This is all important, folks, when we read Paul. This gives him now his credibility. Also, another interesting thing happens. I keep mixing them up here. The very first part of Acts of the Apostles, what is he called? What's his name? Saul. But then starting in Acts chapter 13, what's he now called for the rest of the Bible? Paul. What's all that about? Who changed his name? No. God didn't change his name. Back to what nationality is Saul? What was his heritage?
He was
Jewish. What citizenship did he have? Roman. He had two names. He had his Jewish name, and his, if you want to call it, his Gentile name. He had two names. So look at what Luke does in Acts. The first part where he was this Jew, he calls him Saul. But now when he undergoes the conversion experience, Acts chapter 13, verse 9, look at what happens.
But Saul, also known as Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at him.
Okay, here's in the scriptures where Luke makes the change. Saul, also known as Paul, and from this point in time he's called Paul. Why do you think Luke now uses his Gentile name? His Roman name?
To signify his conversion?
To signify, kind of. Deb knows the answer to this one.
Could it be that he's to be the apostle to the Gentiles?
Bingo! That was his calling. He's called the apostle to the Gentiles. And he's the one who spread the gospel message among Gentiles. Not saying the other apostles didn't. They did too. But Paul, when we read the New Testament, he's the major one in the New Testament. Yeah. So, Paul went out. Just quickly. Paul went out on different missionary journeys. This is what the Bible is all about. He goes out to different parts at different times. He has 4 journeys. I have it on your handouts if you're interested. Actually, the apostles are broken down into his journeys. Okay? So Paul got out and did a lot. He also suffered a lot. Now back to the book of Romans. Finally, right? It is agreed that Paul wrote his letter to the Romans during his 3rd missionary journey. Okay? If you want to read about his journeys, Acts of the Apostles contains them all. But when he wrote the book of Romans, he was on his 3rd missionary journey around 58 A.D. So the context, if Paul wrote the letter to the Romans during his 3rd missionary journey, where was Paul during his 3rd missionary journey? Does anyone know?
He started in Antioch, and he went to Ephesus, and Thessalonica, and Corinth. So all of those are letters he wrote too, huh?
Yeah.
To the Ephesians, to the Corinthians, to the Thessalonians.
It's stated that Paul probably wrote the book of Romans when he was in Corinth. Does that name sound familiar?
Corinthians.
The letter to the Corinthians. It was saying he wrote it around 58 A.D. when he's probably in Corinth. Where's Rome? From Corinth? Yeah, Italy.
Across the Aegean Sea.
Way over, right? The point I'm trying to make here is, did Paul write this letter while he was in Rome? No. Was Paul ever in Rome before?
Well, he must have been if he was in Rome.
Was Paul in Rome before? I like that. No. She's right.
He was a Roman.
He was a Roman citizen, but Paul was never in Rome. This is a real unique thing about the book of Romans. Usually Paul writes to a church that he established or he has been. But he's writing to the church in Rome. Paul was never in Rome prior to writing this letter. So being good detectives, what does that tell us about the church in Rome? Paul wasn't there to start it.
With Peter?
It's already established. So, there's an already existing church in Rome. So that begs the question, how did it start?
Somebody else started.
Somebody else started the church in Rome. Very important component here.